The morning sun barely filtered through the grimy windows of courtroom 7B as 19-year-old Daniel stepped through the heavy wooden doors. His heart pounded in his chest and his palms were already sweating despite the cool air conditioning. He clutched an old leather briefcase that had once belonged to his father, its corners worn and scratched from years of use. Daniel looked younger than his age. His baby face and slim build made most people assume he was still in high school. Today, wearing a slightly oversized suit jacket he'd bought from a thrift store, he probably looked even more out of place in this formal setting. The suit didn't fit quite right, the sleeves a bit too long, but it was the best he could afford on his warehouse worker salary. The courtroom was already filling up with people. Lawyers in expensive suits chatted casually with each other, their leather briefcases probably costing more than Daniel's entire outfit. Court staff moved about efficiently, shuffling papers and preparing for the day's cases. A few other defendants sat nervously in the gallery, waiting for their names to be called. Daniel made his way to the front, his shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. He could feel eyes on him, people wondering what a kid was doing walking up to the defendant's table. He heard a bailiff whisper something to a clerk, and they both glanced his way with amused expressions. Taking his seat at the table, Daniel carefully opened his briefcase and pulled out a neatly organized folder. Inside were documents he'd prepared over the past 2 weeks, working late into the night after his warehouse shifts ended. His fingers trembled slightly as he arranged everything in front of him. This was it. He was really going to represent himself in court. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Holloway," the bailiff announced, and everyone in the courtroom stood up. Judge Holloway entered from a side door, her black robes flowing behind her. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp features and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything, and wasn't impressed by any of it. Her reputation preceded her. Everyone in the county knew that Judge Holloway ran her courtroom with an iron fist and had little patience for people who wasted her time. She took her seat at the bench, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the day's docket. When her eyes landed on the next case, she looked up and scanned the courtroom until her gaze settled on Daniel. Her eyebrows raised and a look of disbelief crossed her face. She glanced down at her papers again, then back at Daniel as if confirming what she was seeing. "Is this some kind of joke?" Judge Holloway's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. Daniel stood up, trying to keep his voice steady. "No, Your Honor, I'm here for my case." "And where exactly is your parent or guardian?" She peered at him over her glasses, her tone dripping with skepticism. This is a real courtroom, not some school project. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Daniel felt heat rising to his cheeks, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact with the judge. "Your Honor, I'm 19 years old. I'm the defendant in this case, and I'm here to represent myself." Judge Holloway leaned back in her chair, a thin smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they think they're dealing with a fool. "You're representing yourself," she repeated slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "Do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into, young man?" "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the charges against me, and I'm prepared to present my defense." The prosecutor at the other table, a middle-aged man named David Brennan, barely looked up from his phone. He'd probably handled hundreds of these small cases, and this was just another routine morning for him. When he did finally glance at Daniel, his expression showed the same mixture of amusement and pity that seemed to fill the room. Judge Holloway shuffled through her papers. "It says here you got a parking ticket that somehow turned into a contempt charge."
"How does that even happen?"
"Your Honor, I questioned the officer's procedure when he issued the citation. I asked to see the photographs and documentation that are required by law, and when I persisted in asking, he added a contempt charge." "So you argued with a police officer?" Judge Holloway said flatly. "Let me guess. You think you know better than a trained law enforcement officer about how to do his job?" "I was asking questions that I believed were legitimate, Your Honor." The judge shook her head slowly, exchanging a glance with the prosecutor that clearly said, "Can you believe this kid?" The prosecutor smirked and finally stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, if I may," Brennan began, his voice smooth and confident. "This seems like a straightforward case. The officer's report is clear and detailed. Perhaps we can resolve this quickly and save the court's valuable time." "I agree, Mr. Brennan," Judge Holloway replied. She turned her attention back to Daniel, speaking in that same slow, patronizing tone. Son, let me give you some advice. I've been sitting on this bench for 15 years. I've seen thousands of cases. Do yourself a favor and just plead guilty. Pay your fine. Take a class if the court requires it and move on with your life. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Daniel's grip tightened on the edge of the table. Every instinct told him to stay quiet, to accept this treatment, to just do what the judge suggested. But he thought about his father, a public defender who had spent his entire career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. His father had always said that the law was supposed to be fair, that it was supposed to protect everyone equally, regardless of how they looked or how much money they had. Your Honor, Daniel said, his voice gaining strength. With respect, I believe I have a valid defense and I'd like the opportunity to present it to the court. Judge Holloway's expression hardened. The courtroom went quiet. Even the prosecutor looked up, slightly interested now in how this would play out. The judge leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made him want to shrink back into his chair. Very well, she said coldly, but don't waste my time, young man. In my courtroom, we deal with facts and law, not teenage attitude. The prosecutor stood up with the confidence of someone who had won this type of case 100 times before. David Brennan was known in the courthouse as a man who didn't lose the small cases. He straightened his expensive tie and picked up a single sheet of paper from his table. Your Honor, this really is quite simple, Brennan began, his voice smooth as silk. Officer Rodriguez issued a citation following standard procedure. The defendant's vehicle was parked in a clearly marked no parking zone during restricted hours. When the officer explained the violation, the defendant became argumentative and refused to accept the citation without causing a scene. Daniel opened his mouth to object, but Judge Holloway held up her hand, stopping him before he could speak. Mr. Brennan is presenting his case, young man. You'll get your turn, if you can manage to wait that long without interrupting. Her tone was sharp, treating him like a child who couldn't control himself in class. A few people in the courtroom snickered. Daniel felt his face burning, but he forced himself to sit still and listen. He'd learned from his father that sometimes in court, you had to let people underestimate you. His dad used to say that was when you could surprise them the most, Brennan continued, clearly enjoying himself. The defendant then proceeded to demand documentation, insisting that proper procedure wasn't followed. When Officer Rodriguez attempted to explain city ordinances, the defendant talked over him repeatedly. That's when the contempt charge became necessary. We can't have citizens thinking they can argue with law enforcement during the performance of their duties. Absolutely right, Judge Holloway agreed, nodding along. She turned to Daniel with that same condescending expression. You see, this is why we have lawyers who go to law school for years. They understand that you can't just demand things from police officers like you're ordering a pizza. More laughter from the gallery. Daniel noticed the court reporter glancing at him with something that might have been sympathy, but she quickly looked away and continued typing. Your Honor, Brennan said, holding up the paper in his hand. I have Officer Rodriguez's report right here. It's detailed, professional, and follows every protocol. I move for summary judgment. There's really no defense against facts this clear. Judge Holloway looked down at Daniel like a teacher about to explain something to a student who just wasn't getting it. Do you understand what summary judgment means, son? It means the prosecutor is asking me to decide this case right now, without going through a full trial, because the facts are so obvious that a trial would be pointless. Daniel gripped the edge of his table. Every word out of her mouth felt designed to make him feel small and stupid. He could feel his heart racing, could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, waiting to see if he'd crack under the pressure. I understand what it means, Your Honor, Daniel said quietly. Oh, you do? The judge's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Well, isn't that impressive? Did you learn that from watching TV shows about lawyers? The courtroom erupted in laughter. Even the bailiff was trying to hide a smile. Daniel's hands were shaking now, but not from fear anymore. It was anger, frustration at being treated this way when all he wanted was a fair hearing. Judge Holloway picked up her gavel, ready to end this farce. Mr. Brennan, I'm inclined to grant your motion. This young man clearly has no business representing himself, and we're wasting valuable court time that could be spent on real cases. Your Honor, please, Daniel said, standing up. His voice came out stronger than he expected. I have evidence that contradicts the officer's report. I have photographs and documentation. Doesn't the court want to see the full picture before making a decision? The judge set down her gavel with an annoyed sigh. Evidence? What kind of evidence could you possibly have? Let me guess, some pictures you took on your phone? Some notes you scribbled down? Son, that's not how evidence works in a real court. Brennan chimed in, his voice dripping with false concern. Your Honor, I think we're being a bit unfair to the young man. Perhaps we should let him present whatever he has, just so he can say he got his day in court, even if it won't change the outcome. The way he said it made it clear he thought Daniel had nothing, that this was all just a show, a waste of time before the inevitable guilty verdict. Judge Holloway checked her watch. Fine. You have 5 minutes, and I do mean 5 minutes. But let me be clear, this is a courtesy. When those 5 minutes are up, I'm making my ruling, and you're not going to like it. Daniel took a deep breath. His father's voice echoed in his head from countless dinner-table conversations about law and justice. When they underestimate you, that's your advantage. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let your preparation speak for itself. He opened his briefcase and pulled out his organized folder. Inside were printed photographs, highlighted copies of city codes, and carefully tabbed documentation. He'd spent 2 weeks preparing this, working through the night after his 10-hour warehouse shifts, surviving on coffee and determination. Your Honor, I'd like to begin by addressing the location of the alleged violation. Daniel started, his voice steady now. He pulled out a photograph and held it up. This was taken at the corner of 5th and Main Street, where I received the citation. Judge Holloway waved her hand dismissively. I know where 5th and Main is. Get to the point. The point, Your Honor, is that the signage at that intersection is contradictory. There are 2 signs within 20 feet of each other. One indicates no parking from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. The other indicates parking allowed with a 2-hour limit during those same hours. Brennan looked up from his phone for the first time, a small frown crossing his face. Daniel continued, pulling out more photographs. According to the city's own municipal code, section 1232, when signage is contradictory or unclear, citations cannot be enforced until the city corrects the problem. I have the relevant code section here highlighted. He laid the documents on his table, organized and professional. The courtroom had gone quiet. Even Judge Holloway had stopped looking at her watch and was actually paying attention to what he was saying. Furthermore, Daniel went on, gaining confidence with each word, the officer's report states I was cited at 2:47 p.m. However, the timestamp on the citation itself shows 2:31 p.m. That's a 16-minute discrepancy. The officer also failed to include photographic evidence of the violation, which is required under department policy for all parking citations where the vehicle's position is relevant to the charge. Brennan was flipping through papers now, his relaxed demeanor starting to crack. Judge Holloway leaned forward in her chair, her expression no longer one of amusement but something harder to read. Daniel reached for another document, his hands no longer shaking. As for the contempt charge, Your Honor, I simply asked the officer to explain which sign I was supposed to follow, and requested to see his photographs. Those are reasonable questions, not contemptuous behavior. The 5 minutes weren't even up yet, but Daniel had already said enough to plant seeds of doubt. He could see it in the way the judge was looking at his documents, in the way the prosecutor had stopped smiling. For the first time since walking into that courtroom, Daniel felt like maybe, just maybe, someone was actually listening to him. Judge Holloway sat back in her chair, studying Daniel with new eyes. The smirk had vanished from her face, replaced by something closer to confusion. She picked up one of the papers in front of her and read it more carefully this time, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Brennan, she said without looking at the prosecutor, do you have photographs from Officer Rodriguez showing the defendant's vehicle at the time of the citation? Brennan shuffled through his file folder, his confident demeanor cracking like ice on a warming pond. I believe they should be in the officer's report, Your Honor. That's not what I asked, Judge Holloway snapped. Do you have photographs, yes or no? No, Your Honor, not with me. Daniel seized the moment. Your Honor, if I may continue. The department's own policy manual, section 415, explicitly states that photographic evidence must be collected for any citation where vehicle position is a factor in the violation. I have a copy of that policy here. He pulled out another document from his folder. It was a printout from the police department's public records, with the relevant section highlighted in yellow. Daniel had spent 3 days just getting access to that document. filing public records requests and following up with phone calls during his lunch breaks. Judge Holloway held out her hand, and the bailiff walked over to take the document from Daniel, delivering it to the judge. She read it silently, her jaw tightening with each line. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Brennan with barely concealed irritation. "Counselor, were you aware of this policy requirement?" Brennan loosened his tie slightly. For a man who'd walked into court expecting an easy victory, he suddenly looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Your Honor, in cases this minor, we typically rely on the officer's professional judgment and written report." "Professional judgment doesn't override department policy," Daniel interjected, then immediately regretted speaking out of turn. But surprisingly, Judge Holloway didn't scold him. She just nodded slowly. "The defendant is correct. Policy exists for a reason, Mr. Brennan." The energy in the courtroom had completely shifted. People who'd been chatting and checking their phones were now paying full attention. The other defendants waiting for their cases were leaning forward in their seats. Even the court clerk had stopped typing and was watching with wide eyes. Daniel felt a surge of confidence he hadn't expected. His father had always told him that the truth had a power of its own, that if you did your homework and stuck to the facts, justice had a way of working out. He'd never really believed it until this moment. "Your Honor, there's more," Daniel continued, pulling out yet another document. The citation lists the violation code as 22500A, which applies to parking within 15 feet of a fire hydrant. But my vehicle was parked 23 feet from the nearest hydrant. I measured it myself and have photographs showing the measurement. He laid out a series of photos on his table. They showed his car, the hydrant, and a measuring tape stretched between them. The numbers were clear and undeniable. 23 feet. Brennan stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to consult with Officer Rodriguez about these discrepancies." "Denied," Judge Holloway said flatly. "You had weeks to prepare this case, Counselor. The defendant managed to do more thorough work than your office, apparently while working a full-time job." She glanced at Daniel. "You do work, don't you?" "Yes, Your Honor. Night shifts at a warehouse." Something flickered across the judge's face. Respect maybe, or perhaps shame at how she'd treated him earlier. She cleared her throat and turned back to Brennan. "What about the contempt charge? Let's hear the defendant's side of that." Daniel took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, when Officer Rodriguez approached my vehicle, I was confused about which sign applied to my parking spot. I asked him politely to explain. When he said I was violating the no parking restriction, I asked if I could see the photographs he'd taken, because I wanted to understand what I'd done wrong." He paused, making sure his voice stayed calm and respectful. "I never raised my voice. I never used profane language. I simply asked questions. The officer became frustrated with my questions and said I was interfering with his duties. That's when he added the contempt charge." Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Did you refuse to accept the initial citation?" "No, Your Honor. I told him I would accept it, but I wanted to understand the violation first so I could either pay it or contest it properly. I thought that was my right." "It is your right," the judge said quietly. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the air conditioning humming. Brennan looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He'd prosecuted thousands of these small cases, probably winning most of them because people either didn't show up or didn't know how to defend themselves. But here was a 19-year-old kid who'd done more legal research than he had. Daniel wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I'd like to cite the case of Williams versus County of Sacramento, where the court ruled that asking legitimate questions of a law enforcement officer during a traffic stop does not constitute contemptuous behavior. Citizens have the right to understand the charges against them." Judge Holloway's eyebrows shot up. "You're citing case law now?" "Yes, Your Honor. Williams versus County of Sacramento, 2019, California Court of Appeals." The judge turned to her computer and typed something, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. After a moment, she stopped and stared at the screen. Daniel held his breath. He'd spent an entire night finding that case, reading through dozens of similar decisions until he found one that fit his situation perfectly. "The case exists," Judge Holloway said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at Daniel, and for the first time there was no mockery in her eyes. "Only questions. Where did you learn to research case law?" Daniel hesitated. This was the moment. He could deflect, could give a vague answer, or he could tell the truth. He thought about his father, about all those nights studying while other kids his age were out having fun. He thought about the bar exam he'd taken just 3 weeks ago, the results he'd received in the mail yesterday. My father was a public defender, Your Honor. He passed away 2 years ago, but he taught me to love the law. After he died, I kept studying. I took online courses while working full-time. And 3 weeks ago, I passed the California bar examination. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Holloway's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then something that looked a lot like embarrassment. She'd spent the last 20 minutes mocking and belittling someone who was, for all practical purposes, a fellow attorney. Brennan sank into his chair, his face pale. "You're a licensed attorney?" Judge Holloway asked, her voice hoarse. "Not officially licensed yet, Your Honor. I'm waiting for my certificate to arrive. But I passed the bar exam on my first attempt. I have the knowledge and the right to defend myself." Judge Holloway removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. In 15 years on the bench, she'd never felt so small. Judge Holloway sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel could see her mind working, replaying every condescending word she'd said, every dismissive gesture she'd made. She finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Mr. Brennan, I'm calling a 15-minute recess. I suggest you use that time to review your case more thoroughly." The bailiff announced the recess and people began filing out into the hallway. Daniel stayed seated, his hands folded on the table in front of him. His heart was still racing, but he felt calmer than he had all morning. The truth was out now. There was no taking it back. Brennan gathered his papers quickly and left without looking at Daniel. A few people from the gallery approached, wanting to shake Daniel's hand or ask him questions, but the bailiff gently directed them outside. The court reporter, however, came over before leaving. "That was impressive," she said quietly. "Your father would be proud." Daniel felt a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you. That means a lot." When the courtroom emptied, Judge Holloway didn't leave. She sat at her bench staring at the documents Daniel had submitted. After a moment, she looked up at him. "Mr. Chen," she said, using his last name properly for the first time. "Would you approach the bench, please?" Daniel stood and walked forward, his shoes echoing in the empty courtroom. Up close, he could see that Judge Holloway looked tired. The harsh courtroom lights revealed lines around her eyes that hadn't been visible from his table. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice low. "What I did today was inexcusable. I judged you based on your age and appearance, not on the merits of your case. That goes against everything I'm supposed to stand for as a judge." Daniel hadn't expected this. He'd been prepared for her to be angry at being proven wrong, or to double down on her position. But genuine remorse? That caught him off guard. "Your Honor, I understand. People make assumptions." "It happens." "No," she said firmly. "It shouldn't happen. Especially not in my courtroom. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and somewhere along the way I got lazy. I started assuming I could tell which cases mattered and which ones didn't, just by looking at the people involved. That's not justice. That's prejudice." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You prepared this case better than most attorneys who practice in my court regularly. The research, the documentation, the way you presented your arguments, it was professional and thorough. And I almost didn't let you speak because I thought you were just some kid who didn't know what he was doing." Daniel shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what my father taught me. He always said that every case matters to the person involved, no matter how small it seems to everyone else." Judge Holloway nodded slowly. "Your father sounds like he was a good man and a good lawyer, the kind we need more of." She looked down at her hands. "When you get your official license, will you practice here in this county?" "I plan to, Your Honor. I want to help people who can't afford expensive attorneys, people like me. Then I hope you'll consider practicing in my courtroom, though I'll understand if you'd rather not after today." Before Daniel could respond, the bailiff opened the door. "5 minutes, Your Honor." Judge Holloway straightened in her chair, her professional demeanor returning. "Thank you. Please ask Mr. Brennan to return." Daniel walked back to his table, his mind spinning. The judge's apology had been unexpected, but he wasn't sure what it meant for his case. Would she rule fairly now, or would she find some other way to save face? People filtered back into the courtroom, the energy different now. Word had spread during the recess about what had happened. Daniel could hear whispers behind him, people speculating about what would happen next. A few reporters had even shown up, their notebooks ready. Brennan returned looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 15 minutes. He set his briefcase down heavily and remained standing. His shoulders slumped. "All rise," the bailiff announced. And Judge Holloway returned to the bench. She surveyed the courtroom, noting the additional observers who'd arrived during the break. Her expression gave nothing away as she picked up her gavel. "We're back on the record in the case of the People versus Daniel Chen. Mr. Brennan, have you had sufficient time to review the defendant's evidence?" Brennan cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. After reviewing the materials and speaking with my office, we believe there are significant procedural issues with this citation that need to be addressed." "Significant procedural issues," Judge Holloway repeated. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Brennan's face reddened. "Your Honor, the discrepancies in the officer's report and the lack of photographic evidence do raise questions about whether proper procedure was followed." "Questions," the judge said dryly. "Mr. Chen raised those same questions at the scene and was threatened with contempt for it. Now suddenly they're legitimate concerns?" Daniel watched the exchange, barely breathing. This was really happening. The judge was holding the prosecutor accountable. Brennan tried again. "Your Honor, in light of the defendant's evidence, the People would like to request a continuance to gather additional documentation and possibly amend the charges." "Denied," Judge Holloway said sharply. "You've had weeks to prepare this case. The defendant gave you more than enough time to get your evidence in order. He managed to collect photographs, research municipal codes, and cite relevant case law while working night shifts at a warehouse. What's your excuse?" The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Brennan opened his mouth, then closed it again, having no good answer. Judge Holloway turned her attention to Daniel. "Mr. Chen, you've presented a well-researched defense that raises serious doubts about the validity of both the parking citation and the contempt charge. You've shown that the signage at the location was contradictory and potentially in violation of municipal code. You've demonstrated discrepancies in the officer's report, including timestamps and measurements, and you've established that your questions at the scene were legitimate inquiries, not contemptuous behavior." She paused, letting her words sink in. Daniel felt his chest tightening with hope, but he didn't let himself celebrate yet. He'd learned that in court, nothing was certain until the gavel came down. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "you've cited relevant case law supporting your position that citizens have the right to understand charges against them without being accused of contempt. The prosecution has failed to provide evidence that contradicts any of your claims or supports their version of, events." Brennan looked like he wanted to object, but couldn't find the words. Judge Holloway picked up her gavel, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Daniel thought about his father, about all those nights studying together at their kitchen table. His dad used to say that the law wasn't about winning or losing. It was about finding the truth and making things right. "Based on the evidence presented," Judge Holloway declared, her voice clear and strong, "this court finds significant procedural failures in how this citation was issued and processed." Judge Holloway's gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack that made everyone in the courtroom jump. The sound echoed off the walls, final and absolute. "The parking citation is hereby dismissed due to contradictory signage and failure to follow department policy regarding photographic evidence," she announced. "Furthermore, the contempt charge is dismissed. Mr. Chen's questions at the scene constituted legitimate inquiry into the charges against him, which is his constitutional right." Daniel felt his knees go weak. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. After all the preparation, all the sleepless nights, all the moments of doubt, it was over. He'd won. But Judge Holloway wasn't finished. She set down her gavel and looked directly at Brennan, her expression stern. "Additionally, I'm ordering the city to conduct a full review of the signage at the intersection of 5th and Main Street. If Mr. Chen found these discrepancies, there are likely other citizens who've been cited improperly. Those cases should be reviewed as well." Brennan nodded stiffly, his face still red. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm also recommending that Officer Rodriguez receive additional training on proper citation procedures and the importance of collecting required documentation. This wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a failure to follow established protocols that exist to protect citizens' rights." The judge's words carried weight beyond just Daniel's case. She was sending a message to everyone in that courtroom, to the police department, to the prosecutor's office, that cutting corners had consequences. Daniel finally allowed himself to breathe. Really breathe. The tension that had been coiled tight in his chest since he'd walked through those courtroom doors began to unwind. His father's voice echoed in his mind again. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, son. But it's always worth it. Judge Holloway's expression softened as she looked at Daniel. Mr. Chen, this court recognizes the exceptional quality of your defense. You demonstrated not only knowledge of the law, but also the diligence and integrity that are the hallmarks of good legal representation. Your father clearly taught you well. Thank you, Your Honor, Daniel managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. When you receive your official attorney license, I hope you'll remember this day. Remember what it feels like to be underestimated and dismissed. Let it make you a better advocate for others who find themselves in similar situations. I will, Your Honor, I promise. As the judge gathered her papers, preparing to move on to the next case, something unexpected happened. Someone in the gallery started clapping. Then another person joined in, and another, until the entire courtroom was applauding. It wasn't the loud, rowdy kind of applause you'd hear at a concert. It was respectful, almost reverent, but it was real. Judge Holloway didn't stop them. She simply nodded at Daniel and allowed the moment to happen. Even Brennan, despite his defeat, gave Daniel a slight nod of acknowledgement before packing up his things. Daniel collected his documents, carefully placing them back in his father's old briefcase. His hands were shaking again, but this time from relief rather than nerves. As he turned to leave, several people approached him. An older woman with gray hair touched his arm gently. My grandson got a ticket at that same intersection last month. He paid it because he couldn't afford to take time off work to fight it. Thank you for doing what he couldn't. A young man in a delivery uniform shook his hand. Man, that was incredible. I've been scared to fight my tickets because I thought I'd just lose anyway. You showed us it's possible. Even one of the court staff members, a clerk who'd been smirking earlier, stopped him on his way out. I've worked here for 8 years, she said quietly. I've never seen anyone stand up to Judge Holloway like that. You earned her respect, and that's not easy to do. Daniel thanked them all, feeling overwhelmed by their kindness. He'd walked into that courtroom thinking only about his own case, his own justice. He hadn't realized that by standing up for himself, he might be standing up for others too. As he stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, Daniel pulled out his phone and checked the time. He had 4 hours before his warehouse shift started. Just enough time to go home, maybe get a little sleep and eat something that wasn't from a vending machine. But first, he made a detour. He drove across town to the cemetery where his father was buried. The small headstone was simple, just his dad's name and the dates of his birth and death, along with the words, Defender of Justice. Daniel sat down on the grass next to the grave, setting his briefcase beside him. We won, Dad, he said softly. I did everything you taught me. I didn't back down, even when they tried to make me feel small, even when it would have been easier to just give up and pay the fine. A breeze rustled through the trees overhead, and Daniel closed his eyes, remembering all those nights at the kitchen table. His father explaining legal concepts, sharing stories from his cases, teaching Daniel that the law was supposed to protect everyone, not just the rich and powerful. I know you always wanted me to be a lawyer, Daniel continued. You said it was one of the few jobs where you could actually make a difference. I didn't understand what you meant back then. I thought you were just being dramatic. He laughed softly. But I get it now. Today I made a difference. Not just for me, but maybe for other people too. The judge is going to review those signs, and who knows how many other people that might help. He sat there for a while longer, just feeling the sun on his face and the peace of the moment. Then he stood up, brushed the grass off his pants, and picked up his briefcase. 3 months later, Daniel received an official letter in the mail. His attorney license had been approved. He was now officially licensed to practice law in the state of California. That same week, he gave notice at the warehouse and opened a small practice focusing on helping people who couldn't afford expensive legal representation. His first real case as a licensed attorney came faster than he expected. A 16-year-old kid had been charged with vandalism, but the evidence seemed shaky. The kid's public defender was overworked and recommended pleading guilty to a reduced charge. But the kid's mother had heard about Daniel, about the young lawyer who'd stood up to Judge Holloway and won. Daniel took the case. And on the day of the hearing, he found himself walking back into courtroom 7B. Judge Holloway looked up as he entered, and this time, her expression held no mockery. Instead, she smiled. "Mr. Chen," she said warmly. "Welcome back. I see you're representing someone today." "Yes, Your Honor, this is my client, Tommy Rodriguez. He's 16 years old, and I believe the charges against him are based on mistaken identity." The judge nodded, her tone professional but respectful. "Very well. Let's hear what you have to say." As Daniel began presenting his case, he noticed a young teenage girl sitting in the gallery, watching with wide eyes. She looked nervous, scared even, probably waiting for her own case to be called. She reminded him of himself just a few months ago, walking into the same courtroom feeling small and powerless. When their eyes met, Daniel gave her a small, encouraging nod. She sat up a little straighter, and in that moment Daniel understood what his father had meant all along. Justice wasn't just about winning cases or knowing the law. It was about giving people hope, about showing them that the system could work for them too if someone was willing to fight. His father would have been proud.